You don't survive 100 kills by being loud. You survive by being forgotten. For 6 years, the only thing Nathan Reed flew was a desk. The maintenance hangar aboard the USS Harlan County smelled like hydraulic fluid and burnt coffee. Reed worked in coveralls 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands permanently stained with grease he could never quite scrub out. Nobody on this boat knew his name meant anything. To them, he was just the quiet contractor who fixed what the real pilots broke. He liked it that way. At 0400, the flight deck was empty except for him and a socket wrench. He ran his palm along the belly of an F divided by a -18E Super Hornet, checking a hydraulic line nobody had asked him to check. His fingers paused over a faded patch sewn into the inside of his jacket collar, one he never let anyone see. He tucked it back under the fabric before anyone walked past. Somewhere below decks, a radar operator was about to see something that didn't make sense. 60 plus contact, en bund, no EFF. Reed didn't know that yet. He just felt it, the way old pilots feel weather before the sky changes. Before we go further, comment below where you're watching from, hit that subscribe button, and give this video a like if stories about hidden heroes hit you right in the chest. Now let's get into it. The general quarters alarm cut through the ship like a blade. Lieutenant Commander Frank Bishop, Air Wing Commander, was already moving before the second klaxon blast finished. "Talk to me," Bishop barked, storming into Combat Information Center. 60+ inbound, sir. Mixed fighters and strike aircraft. No transponders. Formation's too tight to be commercial. The radar tech's voice cracked on the last word. Bishop stared at the scope. In 15 years, he'd never seen a formation that dints outside of an exercise. That's not an exercise number. That's an Armada. He keyed the 1MC. Launch Alert 5. All available Hornets now. Down in the ready room, pilots scrambled into harnesses half-fastened, helmets under arms, boots slamming against steel decking. Bishop counted heads. For qualified strike pilots, 2 on medical hold, 1 recovering from a bad landing 3 days prior. Not enough. Sir, a young lieutenant, Danielle Foster, jogged up beside him, sweat already darkening her flight suit collar. "We're short a pilot for the 5th bird. Maintenance guy. Reed, he's rated, isn't he? Emergency qual, at least." Bishop almost laughed. "Reed fixes jets, Foster. He doesn't fly them. Sir, with respect, we don't have time to be picky." Bishop looked out at the deck, at the 5th Hornet sitting empty, engines cold, and at the wrench-covered mechanic standing beside it like he already knew he'd be needed. He didn't like it, but the sky was filling up fast, and he was out of options. Reed heard his name over the flight deck comms and felt something in his chest tighten. Not fear. Recognition. Like a door he'd bolted shut years ago, creaking open again. "Reed, get suited." Bishop's voice crackled through the handheld radio. "You're flying Bird 5. For a second, Reed didn't move. He just stared at the Hornet in front of him, at the numbers stenciled on its nose, at the sun starting to break over the horizon in thin orange lines. Then he set down the wrench. The flight suit locker held gear he hadn't touched in years. His hands moved through the motions on their own, G-suit, harness, mask, muscle memory older than most of the pilots currently sprinting across the deck. He caught his reflection in the dark visor of his helmet before pulling it on. Older, grayer, same eyes. "You sure about this?" Foster asked, jogging alongside him toward the jet. "No offense, but nobody's seen your logbook." "There's a reason for that," Reed said, and didn't elaborate. She wanted to ask more, but the deck chief was already waving them toward their aircraft, hands cutting sharp signals through the wind. Steam rolled off the catapult tracks. Somewhere behind them, Bishop watched Reed climb into the cockpit with a kind of ease that didn't match a man who supposedly hadn't flown combat in over half a decade. Bishop frowned. Something about the way Reed settled into that seat, hands finding switches without looking, didn't sit right. He filed the thought away. There wasn't time for it now. The catapult fired and slammed Reed back in his seat, the Hornet's engines screaming as the deck fell away beneath him. G-forces pressed his chest flat, familiar in a way that made his stomach drop harder than the acceleration alone should have. "Still got it," he thought, and wasn't sure if that comforted him or scared him. Formation check. Bishop's voice crackled over the tactical net. All business now. Reed, you copy? Copy, lead. Reed's voice came out flatter, steadier than Bishop expected. No hositación. No nerves. Foster, flying off Reed's wing, glanced sideways through her canopy at the 5th Hornet, holding a textbook-perfect formation position. Better than perfect, actually. Tighter than regulation called for. The kind of precision instructors demanded and rarely got. Lead, radar contact. The E-2 controller's voice broke in, tense. Bandits at your 12, 40 miles, closing fast. Confirmed hostile, weapons hot. Reed's display lit up with contacts, a swarm of blips pushing toward the strike group like a wall of static. He did the math instantly, without needing the computer to do it for him. Closure rate, intercept geometry, fuel margins. Numbers he hadn't run in years came back like they'd never left. Lead, this is Bird 5, Reed said, calm as still water. Recommend split formation, high-low pincer, force them to commit early. Silence on the net for a beat too long. Say again, 5, Bishop said slowly. Where'd a maintenance officer learn pincer tactics? Reed didn't answer. Ahead of him, the horizon was starting to fill with contrails. Bishop didn't have time to press the question. The bandits were already breaking into 2 groups, exactly the way Reed predicted, and there was no denying the tactic worked. Fine, execute high-low, Bishop snapped. Foster, you're with me high. Reed, take low with Hoffman. Lieutenant Kevin Hoffman, Flying Bird 3, keyed his mic, copy lead. 5, on your wing. The 2 Hornets peeled off together, dropping altitude fast, wings rocking through turbulence as the enemy formation grew from specks to shapes to distinguishable aircraft, swept wings, dark paint, weapons already visible under their wings. Talk to me, Reed, Hoffman said, voice tight. I've never seen a formation this big outside a red flag briefing. Because it's not supposed to exist, Reed said quietly, which means somebody built it specifically to overwhelm a single carrier group. How do you know that? Reed didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the lead enemy aircraft, tracking its flight path, reading its intentions before it committed to them. A skill you didn't learn fixing hydraulic lines. Missile lock warning. His RWR chirped, a sharp tone cutting through the cockpit. Brake right, Reed called, already moving before the words finished leaving his mouth, stick and rudder working in perfect coordination as the Hornet snapped into a hard defensive turn, chaff spitting from the airframe behind him. Hoffman broke late, cursing, barely evading the missile-trailing smoke past his canopy. Jesus, Hiji Hoffman Gaspid. Where did you learn to fly like that? Reed didn't answer Hoffman's question. He was too busy reading the battle space unfolding around him. 6 bandits breaking formation, splitting into attack pairs, the classic signature of a coordinated strike package rather than a disorganized swarm. Lead, this is 5, Reed radioed, voice level. These aren't conscripts. Whoever's flying lead knows exactly what they're doing. How would you know that? Bishop snapped from high cover, frustration bleeding into his voice. Because I train people who fly like this. The words hung on the frequency for a moment too long. Nobody responded. Nobody had time to. Bandit 2 breaking toward Hoffman. The E-2 controller called out, urgency rising. 6 miles and closing. Reed rolled his Hornet hard, positioning himself between Hoffman and the incoming threat without being asked. His hands moved across the cockpit with an economy of motion that came from somewhere deeper than training. Somewhere that had been buried under years of grease and quiet and forgotten paperwork. Down in CIC, a young intelligence specialist named Christine Bennett watched the tactical display, brow furrowed. Something about the call sign designation on Bird 5's IFF caught her attention. A maintenance transponder code that didn't match the flight pattern she was seeing. That's not maintenance flying, she murmured to herself. That's textbook. She pulled up the personnel database, fingers hovering over the keyboard. On instinct, she typed in Reed's name. The system returned an error. Access restricted. Level 6 clearance required. Bennett frowned. Maintenance officers didn't have restricted files. Sir, you need to see this, Bennett said, waving Bishop's executive officer over to her station. Reed's personnel file is locked. Level 6. The XO, Commander Gregory Sinclair, leaned over her shoulder, reading the error message twice like it might change. That's above my clearance, too. That kind of lock usually means special operations or something classified enough that even the Navy pretends it doesn't exist, Bennett finished. Sinclair straightened, glancing at the tactical display where Bird 5 was still weaving through the fight with unnerving precision. Get Bishop on the horn. He needs to know who he sent up there. Up in the fight, Reed had no idea anyone was looking. His entire world had narrowed to stick, throttle, and the 6 aircraft trying to kill his squadron mates. He rolled inverted, pulling the nose through the horizon in a maneuver that made his vision gray at the edges, positioning for a shot he wasn't sure the newer pilots would even recognize. Fox 2, he called, voice flat, and released a missile that found its mark within seconds. Splash 1 Bandit. The controller confirmed, disbelief evident even through the radio static. Foster, watching from high cover, Keter Mike lead. Did the maintenance guy just... I saw it, Bishop said quietly. Something cold was settling in his stomach, a memory trying to surface that he couldn't quite place. A name, a call sign, something from a briefing years ago, buried under a stack of classified folders he'd been told never to ask about. Bishop, Sinclair's voice cut in over a secure channel. You need to hear this. Reed's file is locked at level 6, Sinclair said. That's not maintenance clearance. That's the kind of lock they put on people who used to teach at Fallon. Bishop's jaw tightened. Fallon, the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Top Gun. That's not possible, Bishop said, but even as the words left his mouth, he was replaying the last 20 minutes. The pincer tactic call, the missile break timing, the shot Reed had just taken with a confidence no 6-year desk pilot should have. Sir, there's a name, Bennett cut in. It's redacted in most fleet records, but there's a training document from 9 years ago still floating in the old Fallon archive. Instructor call sign, Trident. Bishop went still. He remembered now. A name whispered in ready rooms like a ghost story. An instructor so good, so quietly devastating in a jet, that other Top Gun graduates still measured themselves against a standard they'd never met in person. Trident had vanished from the program without explanation. Nobody talked about why. Reed, Bishop said into his mic, slower this time. What's your call sign? Static. Then, finally, Reed's voice came back, tired, unhurried, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long time. You already know, sir. Below him, 3 more bandits were forming up for a second run at the strike group, and Reed rolled his Hornet toward them without waiting for permission. Trident, Bishop said, testing the word like it might dissolve. Your Trident was, Reed corrected, banking hard into a spread of incoming contacts. A long time ago. You trained half the department heads on this ship, Bishop said, disbelief cracking his usual command tone. Why the hell are you turning wrenches in a maintenance hangar? Reed didn't answer immediately. His eyes tracked the enemy formation reshaping below him. 3 aircraft breaking into an attack run aimed at the carrier's flank. Story for another day, sir. Right now we've got a bigger problem. Copy that, Bishop said, and for the first time since the alarm sounded, there was something different in his voice. Not doubt. Trust. Bandits forming for a strike run on the boat. The E2 controller called, voice climbing. They're going for the carrier directly. Negative, Reed said, already diving. Not on my watch. He pushed the throttle forward, the Hornet's airframe groaning under the strain, G-forces mounting until his vision narrowed to a tunnel. Below him, 3 enemy aircraft closed in tight formation, confident, unaware that the pilot bearing down on them had once taught men how to counter exactly this kind of attack. Foster's voice crackled through, breathless. Lead, 5's diving solo into 3 bandits. That's a 15-second window at best. He knows, Bishop said quietly, watching the radar blip descend with terrifying precision. Let him work. Reed's radar warning receiver screamed as all 3 bandits locked onto him simultaneously. A textbook trap, and he'd walked right into the center of it on purpose. Good, he thought. Focus on me, not the boat. 5, you've got 3 locks. The controller warned, unnecessary but automatic. Copy, Reed said, and pulled the stick hard left, rolling the Hornet through a barrel maneuver that put 2 of the 3 missiles into a chase they couldn't win, his jets nose-crossing their seeker cones at an angle that broke their tracking solution entirely. The 3rd missile stayed locked. Reed waited. 2 seconds. 3. Every instinct in the cockpit screaming at him to break now. And he held the turn a half-second longer than any sane pilot would, letting the missile close the distance before snapping into a defensive spiral that bled its closure rate to nothing. It flashed past his canopy close enough to rattle the airframe, then tumbled harmlessly into the ocean below. Splashed the lock, he reported, voice still flat, like he'd just finished a routine inspection instead of dodging death by feel alone. Hoffman, watching from a mile out, exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. How was he not scared? Because he's done this before, Bishop said. More times than any of us will ever know. Reed rolled back toward the 2 remaining bandits, missile tone already climbing in his headset, and there was no hesitation left in him now. Only the old, familiar quiet that came right before the fight turned in his favor. Reed's missile tone locked solid, and he squeezed the trigger without ceremony. Fox 2. The missile leapt off the rail, a streak of white against the pale morning sky, closing the distance to the trailing bandit in seconds. The explosion was small and distant, more smoke than fire, but it was enough to break the remaining 2 aircraft off their attack line. Splash 2. The controller confirmed, voice tight with disbelief. 5. That's your 2nd kill. Reed didn't respond. He was already tracking the last bandit in the immediate group, watching it bank hard toward the cloud deck, trying to disengage now that the numbers had shifted. Let him run, Reed said quietly. Priority's the main formation. There's still 50-plus contacts out there. Bishop, high above, checked his own scope and felt his stomach drop. Reed was right. The initial engagement had only been a probing wave. The bulk of the enemy formation was still 40 miles out, reorganizing, and now it was clear why. They'd been testing the strike group's response, gauging capability before committing to real force. They know what they're up against now, Bishop said grimly. Command, this is Falcon Lead. We need every available bird in the air. This isn't a raid. It's an invasion attempt. Down in CIC, Bennett stared at the tactical plot, watching red icons multiply across the screen. Sir, she said to Sinclair, if that whole formation commits at once, we don't have enough airframes to stop it. Sinclair's eyes moved to the icon labeled Bird 5, still holding position at the front of the formation, waiting. Then it's a good thing, Sinclair said slowly. We've got Trident back. Reed keyed his mic, comm cutting through the mounting panic on the frequency. All aircraft, this is 5. If they're staging for a full push, we need to break their formation before it commits. Hit the leaders, not the mass. Cut the head off. That's a division of 4 against 60, Bishop said. Even from you, that's insane. I didn't say we win it alone, Reed replied. I said we buy time. Fold their coordination, and their numbers stop matching. Bishop hesitated only a second. 6 years ago, he might have argued. Now, hearing the calm certainty in Reed's voice, the same voice half his department heads had once described in hushed, reverent tones, he made his decision fast. Copy. Foster, Hoffman, form up on 5. He's calling a play. The 4 Hornets reformed into a loose diamond. Reed at the point, weapons systems humming as they pushed toward the reorganizing enemy formation. Reed's eyes scanned the enemy lead aircraft, the one flying with the tightest discipline, the one clearly coordinating the others. That one, Reed said. Killed ahead, the body panics. Copy. 5's target first. Foster confirmed, voice steadier now, drawing confidence from the man she dismissed as a washed-up mechanic less than an hour ago. Below deck, word had started to spread through the ship. Whispers in passageways, sailors gathering around monitors in the mess hall, watching the tactical feed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The name Trident moved from mouth to mouth like a secret finally let loose. Nobody on that ship had known. Now everybody wanted to. The enemy formation reorganized into 3 attack waves, exactly as Reed predicted, confirming what he already suspected. This wasn't improvised aggression. Someone on the other side had studied carrier strike group doctrine in detail, someone who understood exactly how to overwhelm a depleted air wing. "They're testing our doctrine," Reed said over the net. "Whoever's leading that formation trained somewhere that taught our playbook." "How would they know our playbook?" Hoffman asked, voice edged with unease. Reed didn't answer that question. His jaw tightened behind his oxygen mask, a flicker of memory surfacing. Faces from a classroom years ago, foreign exchange pilots who'd rotated through advanced tactics courses before certain programs were quietly shut down. He pushed the thought aside. There wasn't time. "Focus on the fight in front of you," Reed said instead. "Diamond formation, staggered altitude, target the lead pair first." The four Hornets split into a coordinated attack pattern, engines screaming as they closed the final 10 miles to the enemy formation. Reed's display filled with contacts, more than he'd seen in a single engagement even during his years at Fallon. "Fox 3, multiple targets," Bishop called, loosing missiles in a coordinated volley alongside Foster and Hoffman. Reed held his fire a beat longer, watching the enemy lead pilot's flight path, waiting for the exact moment of commitment, the half-second window where evasion became impossible. "Fox 2, he finally called, and the missile leapt free. The enemy lead aircraft never had a chance to react. The lead enemy aircraft disintegrated in a burst of fire and debris, and just as Reed predicted, the formation behind it faltered, aircraft breaking in different directions, coordination collapsing without their anchor point. Formations fragmenting. The E2 controller called, relief audible. Multiple bandits breaking east, disengaging. "Don't let up," Reed warned. "Wounded formations regroup if you give them room." Bishop pressed his advantage, diving after two retreating bandits with Foster on his wing, missile locks chirping steadily in his headset. Hoffman peeled off to cover Reed's 6, watching the older pilot fly with a precision that made the younger man's hands feel clumsy on his own controls by comparison. "5, you've got two bandits converging on your 9, Hoffman warned. "Copy. See them," Reed said, already rolling into a defensive break that put both enemy aircraft into a scissors they couldn't win against a pilot who'd taught the maneuver to 3 generations of naval aviators. Down in CIC, Bennett watched the tactical display transform in real time. Enemy formation numbers dropping steadily, retreat vectors multiplying across the screen. She glanced at Sinclair, who hadn't taken his eyes off Bird 5's icon in almost 10 minutes. "Sir, at this rate, they'll be fully disengaged within the hour," she said. Sinclair nodded slowly, something like disbelief still lingering in his expression. "One man," he murmured. "I read about instructors like this. I never thought I'd watch one work." On the radio, Reed's voice remained as flat and unbothered as it had been at the start, betraying nothing of the fight raging around him, except for one moment, when a stray transmission caught a single word muttered under his breath, almost too quiet to hear. A name, not his own. Bishop caught the transmission too, faint and half-swallowed by static, but unmistakable. A name Reed hadn't said in years. One that slipped out only because his guard had finally cracked under the weight of old memory colliding with the present fight. Bishop filed it away. There'd be time for questions later, if there was a later. Bandits disengaging in force, the controller reported, elation breaking through her professional tone. Enemy formation reducing to under 20 contacts, all retreating on a northeast heading. "Copy," Reed said, though something in his voice had changed, a rawness underneath the calm that hadn't been there before. He pulled his Hornet into a wide banking turn, watching the retreating aircraft shrink against the horizon. "5, you good?" Hoffman asked, noticing the shift. "Fine," Reed said too quickly. Foster, closing formation on his wing, glanced over at his cockpit through the canopy glass. Even from a distance, she could see his shoulders had dropped, the tension of combat replaced by something heavier. Grief, maybe, or memory, finally catching up to a man who'd spent 6 years running from both. "Command, this is Falcon Lead," Bishop radioed, voice steady despite everything. "Enemy formation in full retreat. Requesting battle damage assessment and recovery vectors for all aircraft." "Copy, Falcon Lead. Good work up there." Bishop almost laughed at the understatement. Good work didn't begin to cover what he'd just watched. A mechanic in coveralls turning into the deadliest pilot in the sky within the span of 40 minutes, dismantling half an invasion force with a skill set nobody on this ship had known existed. As the Hornets turned back toward the carrier, Bishop found himself staring at Bird 5's silhouette against the rising sun, wondering exactly how much more there was to the story nobody had asked Nathan Reed to tell. The flight back to the carrier felt longer than the fight itself. Reed flew in silence, letting muscle memory handle the formation join up while his mind drifted somewhere he hadn't let it go in years. The name that had slipped out over the radio belonged to a wingman. A young Lieutenant Reed had trained personally, fast and fearless and reckless in the way only the best students ever were. 6 years ago, during a joint exercise that went sideways into something far more real than anyone expected, that wingman hadn't made it home. Reed had, and he'd never forgiven himself for the difference. 5. You're cleared for approach. Angels 2. The LSO's voice crackled through his headset, pulling him back into the present. Copy. Cleared approach, Reed replied, voice steady again, the old discipline reasserting itself. Below him, the carrier deck came into view, sailors already gathering along the edges despite standing orders to stay clear during recovery operations. Word had spread fast. Everyone wanted to see the mechanic who'd apparently saved the ship. Reed lined up his approach with textbook precision, the kind of landing that made LSOs nod in quiet approval instead of gripping their radio's intention. Wheels touched down clean, the tailhook catching the third wire with a jolt that rattled his teeth and settled something in his chest at the same time. He'd done it. He was back on deck, alive, for reasons he still didn't fully understand himself. As his canopy rose and the sea air rushed in, Reed caught sight of Bishop already standing at the edge of the flight line, arms crossed, watching him with an expression Reed couldn't quite read yet. Reed climbed down from the cockpit slowly, legs unsteady after the adrenaline finally started to fade. The deck around him had gone quiet in a way flight decks rarely did. Sailors pausing mid-task, maintenance crews standing still, all eyes drawn toward the man in the oversized flight suit who'd just landed like he'd never stopped flying. Bishop crossed the deck first, stopping a few feet away, studying Reed's face like he was trying to reconcile two different people occupying the same body. Trident, Bishop said quietly, testing the name aloud for the first time in person. That was a long time ago, sir, Reed said, pulling off his helmet, sweat-damp hair sticking to his forehead. 9 kills confirmed this morning, Bishop said. Formation broken, invasion force in full retreat. That's not ancient history. That's right now. Reed didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, toward the empty patch of sky where the enemy formation had disappeared. Why maintenance? Bishop asked, the question he'd been holding back since the CIC report. Why had a service record like yours? Reed's jaw tightened, the same tell Bishop had noticed earlier in the fight, the one that meant he was choosing his words carefully. Because the last time I flew combat, I brought back one less pilot than I left with. I decided I was done being responsible for people's lives in the air. The words landed heavy on the deck between them, and for the first time, Bishop understood. Not the tactics, not the training, but the man underneath both. You saved this entire strike group today, Bishop said, including every pilot who flew with you. I know, Reed said quietly. Doesn't undo what happened before. Bishop didn't have an answer for that, not one that would mean anything to a man who'd carried that weight alone for 6 years. Instead, he did the only thing that felt right. He straightened to attention and saluted. It caught Reed off guard, enough that he almost forgot to return it. Around them, the deck crew who'd gathered to watch began to follow Bishop's lead. One by one, sailors and officers snapping to attention, a wave of silent respect spreading across the flight deck for a man most of them hadn't known existed 12 hours earlier. Foster climbed down from her own cockpit nearby, pulling off her helmet, staring at the scene with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. That's the guy who fixed my landing gear last week, she murmured to Hoffman. Yeah, Hoffman said. and apparently the guy who taught half the department heads on this boat how to fly. Reed held the salute a beat longer than protocol required, something complicated passing across his face before he let his hand drop. He wasn't used to this. The attention, the weight of being seen after so many years of choosing not to be. At ease, Bishop said finally, voice rough. All of you. The deck slowly returned to motion, sailors resuming their tasks. Though the atmosphere had shifted permanently, word would spread through the fleet within days. The mechanic who turned out to be a legend, the quiet man who'd single-handedly broken an invasion force before breakfast. Reed just wanted his wrench back. That evening, after the recovery operations wound down and the ship settled into its usual rhythm, Bishop found Reed alone in the maintenance hangar, exactly where he'd been 12 hours earlier before the world interrupted his quiet routine. Reed was running his hand along the same hydraulic line he'd inspected that morning, though his mind clearly wasn't on the work. "You didn't have to come find me," Reed said without turning around. "I wanted to," Bishop replied, stepping further into the hangar. "I owe you an apology. I wrote you off the moment I saw you in those coveralls. Didn't ask questions. Didn't wonder why a man your age was fixing jets instead of flying them." "You had no reason to wonder," Reed said. "That was the point." Bishop studied him for a long moment. "The wingman. The one you lost. What was his name?" Reed's hands stilled on the hydraulic line. For a moment, Bishop thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Daniel," Reed said finally quiet. "Lieutenant Daniel Carter. Best natural stick I ever trained. He trusted my calls that day, and I got the geometry wrong by half a second. That's all it takes sometimes. Half a second." "That wasn't your fault," Bishop said. "Doesn't matter whose fault it was," Reed said. "It was my responsibility, and I couldn't carry that weight and still send other people's names into a headset every day, knowing I might get it wrong again." Bishop didn't push further. Some wounds needed space, not solutions. "You flew today anyway," Bishop said instead, knowing exactly what that weight felt like. "Didn't have a choice," Reed said. "Foster needed a fifth pilot. I wasn't going to let people die today because I was still scared of what happened 6 years ago." Bishop leaned against the workbench, considering his next words carefully. "The Navy's going to want you back in a cockpit, Reed. Full-time. After what happened today, there's no version of this where they let a pilot with your record keep turning wrenches." Reed exhaled slowly, the sound heavier than a simple breath. "I know. Is that what you want?" The question hung in the quiet hangar, mixing with the smell of hydraulic fluid and distant ocean air drifting through the open bay doors. Reed thought about the formation this morning, the calm clarity that had settled over him the moment he took the stick, the parts of himself he'd buried under 6 years of silence that had come roaring back the instant he needed them. "I don't know yet," Reed admitted, "but I know I'm done pretending the last 6 years erased who I used to be." Bishop nodded slowly, understanding, settling into something like respect. "For what it's worth, Carter would be proud of what you did up there today." Reed's throat tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, just stared at the hydraulic line still resting under his palm, the same quiet resolve from that morning settling back into his shoulders. "Get some rest, Trident," Bishop said, turning to leave. "The fleet's going to want to hear your story eventually." "Not today," Reed said quietly, and Bishop let him have that. News of the engagement spread through the fleet faster than anyone expected. By the following morning, Reed's name, his real call sign, at least, had reached commands far beyond the Harlan County, whispered in briefing rooms, and passed along secure channels with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. Admiral Patricia Doyle, commanding the broader carrier strike group, requested a full debrief by midday. Reed stood in front of a room of senior officers for the first time in 6 years, still in his maintenance coveralls because it was the only uniform he had left that fit. "Walk us through your tactical decisions," Doyle said, studying him with sharp, assessing eyes. "Specifically the pincer call at the outset. That's not standard doctrine. It's Fallon doctrine," Reed said. "From before certain programs were shut down. I adapted it for a numerically inferior force facing a coordinated strike package." Doyle's expression flickered with recognition. "You taught that program." "I did. And the enemy formation's tactics, the way they staged their attack in waves, tested our response before committing. That's textbook material from that same era. Reed's jaw tightened, the same tell Bishop had learned to recognize. I noticed that too, Admiral. The room went quiet. Nobody needed to say aloud what that implied. That whoever built and led that invasion force had, at some point, learned from the same playbook Reed once taught. We'll need you to consult on threat analysis, Doyle said finally. Effective immediately. The debrief stretched late into the afternoon, questions circling back again and again to details Reed had spent 6 years trying not to think about. By the time he finally stepped out onto the flight deck, the sun was dipping low, painting the ocean in shades of amber and rust. Foster found him there, leaning against the railing, watching the wake trail out behind the ship. Figured you'd want a break from all the questions, she said, handing him a cup of coffee from the wardroom. Appreciate it, Reed said, accepting it with a small nod. For what it's worth, Foster said, I'm sorry. For what I said yesterday. About your logbook. Reed almost smiled. You weren't wrong to ask. I gave you every reason to doubt me. Still, Foster leaned against the railing beside him. You saved my life up there. All of us, really. That's not something I'm going to forget. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the horizon fade from orange to deep blue. Reed thought about Carter, about the weight he'd carried alone for 6 years, about the version of himself that had climbed into that cockpit yesterday morning, not knowing if he'd remember how to be the pilot everyone once depended on. He had remembered. That much, at least, was settled now. You going back to maintenance tomorrow? Foster asked. Reed considered the question longer than he expected to. Haven't decided yet. For what it's worth, Foster said, the squadron could use someone like you. The real you, not the guy hiding in coveralls. That night, Reed sat alone in the small berthing compartment he'd occupied for 6 years, pulling a worn footlocker out from under his bunk for the first time since he'd come aboard. Inside, buried under old maintenance manuals he'd used as cover, was a folded flight suit patch he hadn't looked at in years. A trident, stitched in faded gold thread against a dark blue background. He turned it over in his hands, thinking about Carter, about the classroom full of eager young pilots he'd once trained, about the version of himself that had believed teaching was safer than flying, until yesterday proved that safety had never really been the point. A knock sounded at his door. Bishop, still in his flight suit, holding 2 cups of coffee. Mind if I sit? Bishop asked. Reed gestured to the empty bunk across from him. Bishop sat, handing over one of the cups, his eyes drifting to the patch still resting in Reed's palm. That from Fallon? Bishop asked. Graduation gift, Reed said. From my last class, before I requested transfer to maintenance. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't wear it either. Bishop nodded slowly, understanding more than he let on. Doyle's putting together a proposal. Reactivating your flight status. Full instructor role for the strike group. She wants you developing counter-tactics against whoever built that formation. And if I say no, then you say no, Bishop said simply. Nobody's going to force you back into a cockpit, Reed. You've earned the right to choose this time. Reed turned the patch over once more before setting it down on the small desk beside his bunk, deliberately, like a decision finally taking shape. I'll do it, he said. Not because the Navy needs a hero. Because somewhere out there, whoever's leading that formation learned from the same playbook I taught. That's my responsibility to fix, not anyone else's. Bishop nodded, something like relief passing across his face. For what it's worth, Carter's family still lives near Pensacola. I looked it up after the debrief. If you ever wanted to talk to them. I've thought about it, Reed admitted. Every year on the anniversary. Never had the courage to actually do it. Maybe now you do, Bishop said, standing to leave. You found the courage for everything else yesterday. After Bishop left, Reed sat alone for a long time, turning the patch over in his hands, feeling the weight of it differently than he had in years. Not as a burden, but as something closer to purpose reclaimed. The next morning, he reported to the flight line in a proper flight suit for the first time in 6 years, the trident patch sewn back onto his collar where it belonged. Sailors who passed him on the deck nodded with quiet respect, none of them needing an explanation anymore. Foster fell into step beside him as he walked toward the ready room. Ready, Trident? Reed allowed himself a small, tired smile. Let's find out. The invasion force never returned to test the Harlan County again, but the tactics Reed developed in the following weeks would go on to reshape strike group doctrine across the entire fleet. Quiet work, done without fanfare, exactly the way he preferred it. He never sought recognition for what happened that morning. No medals ceremony, no press release, no headline bearing his name. Just a mechanic's coveralls traded for a flight suit, and a patch that finally stayed sewn where it belonged. Sometimes, late in the evening, sailors would still catch him in the hangar bay, running his hands along hydraulic line out of old habit, checking work that didn't need checking. Old instincts, he told them. Hard to shake. They didn't push him for stories. They didn't need to. They'd all seen it themselves. A lone hornet against an armada. One man's steady hands turning the impossible into something quietly, devastatingly ordinary. If this story hit home, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what you'd have done in Bishop's position, and subscribe for more unforgettable military and aviation stories.